She said she was learning to cook. It started on a rainy Tuesday, the kind where everything smells like wet asphalt and old regrets. Natalie walked through the door with a paper bag full of fresh herbs and a spark in her eyes. "I signed up for a cooking class," she announced, brushing raindrops from her coat like they were trophies. Her cheeks were pink with excitement. "I want to learn how to make real carbonara, not the cream-drenched kind we always get, but the authentic Roman version." I smiled, the way husbands do when their wives pick up a new passion. She pulled out sprigs of rosemary, a bundle of thyme, a wedge of hard cheese I couldn't pronounce. It all smelled fresh and real like a farmer's market, just kissed her hands. That night, nothing got cooked. She said they covered kitchen safety and knife skills, super basic stuff, boring, but she still talked for an hour about her instructor, a passionate foodie who made bechamel sound like poetry. Over the next few weeks, this became a rhythm. Natalie would come home buzzing about roux, emulsification, confit, molecular gastronomy. She'd flash screenshots of recipes, pull me into conversations about butter quality, show me videos of delicate sugar work and artisan bread scoring. She even bought a French rolling pin, but our stove remained untouched. Her apron stayed crisp, its tag still stiff on the inside seam. The rosemary wilted, forgotten in the crisper. I didn't question it at first. We've been together a long time. People go through phases. I'd had my own weird kicks, collecting vinyl, DIY homebrewing, learning to play jazz piano poorly, but something felt off. Cooking is hands-on, messy, but Natalie stayed pristine. No flour on her cheek, no garlic under her nails. One night, I came home early from work. The house smelled like her new citrus candle, lemon basil, not dinner. She was already out, said she had a class on soufflés. She didn't answer when I called. I looked at the kitchen. Spotless. Apron hanging untouched on the pantry door, no whisk in the sink, no baking trays out to dry. A week later, she came home late, cheeks flushed, saying the class ran long. We worked on timing, how not to let risotto turn mushy. She leaned in, her breath warm, fragrant, but not with wine or onions. With perfume, I nodded, smiled again, but something had shifted. That night, I checked the laundry. Her apron was still clean. So were all the dish towels. She said she was learning to cook, but every part of me had already tasted the lies. And one night I decided I was done pretending. At first, I convinced myself it was just a phase. People start hobbies they never follow through on, buy guitars and never learn a chord, register for marathons and never train. Maybe Natalie had simply fallen in love with the idea of cooking more than the act itself. Maybe she just wanted something new to talk about, a passion to claim. But then the stories started stacking up like mismatched plates. She'd come home flushed with excitement, animatedly describing how her instructor demonstrated flambeing or how she'd finally gotten her roux the right color. But when I looked around, there were no signs of practice. No scorched towels, no lingering smell of burnt sugar or sautéed shallots. The stove looked like it hadn't been touched since last Christmas. Her knives were still neatly tucked away in the block, their blades undulled. One evening she came in with a container of risotto she claimed to have made. I stayed late at the kitchen lab to perfect the texture, she said, pressing the warm plastic into my hand. It looked too perfect. The rice was glossy, each grain intact. When I asked what kind of stock she used, she blinked for half a second too long before saying, "Chicken. Homemade, of course." She couldn't describe what herbs she'd added, the usual ones. I didn't argue. I nodded, tasted it, smiled politely. But the suspicion was there now, threading itself through every word she said. She started dressing differently for her classes, too. At first it was just a casual sweater and jeans. But soon she was pairing lipstick with earrings and adding a spritz of her nicer perfume. Her phone would light up with texts during dinner, and she'd always pick it up, glance at the screen with a tiny smile, before flipping it face down. I noticed her hands one night. We were watching a movie, her feet tucked under her on the couch, her wine glass resting in her palm. Her nails were clean, trimmed, still painted with the same polish from the week before. But more than that, her fingers didn't show a single mark, no cuts, no flour under the nails, no burns or bruises, no evidence of hours spent in a kitchen. Cooking isn't clean, not real cooking. It leaves traces, smells, stains, scars. Her apron still looked brand new, the folds still sharp like it had just come out of the bag. Then there was the smell. She always came home fresh, floral, never garlicky or smoky or tinged with that buttery, rich scent that clings to someone who's been standing over a hot stove for hours. I knew that smell. My mother was a chef. She'd come home every day with oil in her pores and flour in her hair. It was unmistakable. Natalie never smelled like that. I began testing her without being obvious one night. I asked how to temper chocolate properly, just to see if she'd fumble. She hesitated, gave a vague answer about melting it slowly, something about using a spoon. "Double boiler," she said after a pause, like she was reaching for something half-remembered from an article, not a class. "That's how you do it, right?" she added, as if I was the student. The next day I opened her calendar. There were blocked-off times labeled class, but no address, no notes, no invoices. Just generic entries, all marked private. I checked the browser history, mostly Pinterest recipes and a few YouTube videos. Nothing recent. No culinary school websites, no course portals, no downloadable syllabi. I didn't want to become that man, paranoid, snooping, obsessive. But the lies weren't even well cooked. They were raw and obvious, just dressed up in the right language. One evening I asked to join her for a class. "Maybe I'll learn how to make your risotto," I joked. She laughed too hard, waved the idea away with an exaggerated smile. "It's just beginner stuff," she said. "You'd be bored. Besides, it's kind of my escape, you know." I nodded, said I understood, but I didn't. I understood something else, that when someone needs an escape, it's usually from you. I stopped pressing, I stopped asking, but I started watching more closely. She said she was learning to cook. I was beginning to learn something else entirely. There's a moment in every unraveling where doubt is replaced by something colder, certainty. Mine came on a Thursday night, the kind of night where even the moon seems to stay hidden out of shame. Natalie had left in a hurry, her tone unusually clipped. She said they were doing fish tonight. Pan-seared sea bass with beurre blanc. She even joked that she might come home smelling like a French kitchen. She kissed me on the cheek, careful not to smear her lipstick, and disappeared into the dark. I didn't plan to follow her, not really, but I also didn't stop myself when the thought crossed my mind. My keys were already in my hand before I knew what I was doing. I waited 10 minutes, enough to keep her comfortable in the lie, then slipped out quietly. The first twist came almost immediately. Instead of heading toward the commercial district, where she said the cooking school was located, Natalie turned toward the old part of town. It wasn't the most direct route, and it certainly wasn't where any culinary institute was. I hung back, keeping a few cars between us, pulse steady, hands gripping the wheel tighter than needed. She drove with confidence, not like someone following directions on a phone. She'd been there before. 15 minutes later, she pulled into a narrow side street lined with tall sycamores and cozy buildings that looked untouched by time. I passed by slowly, watching as she parked near a small bistro tucked into the corner of an alley. The sign read Il Ragazzo, hand-painted in rustic lettering, the kind of place that didn't advertise, didn't need to. You either knew it existed or you didn't. I parked further down and walked back on foot, my breath forming thin clouds in the air. The windows of Il Ragazzo were fogged slightly from the warmth inside, but clear enough to see through if you stood close. And I did. I stood just outside the golden spill of light, hidden by the shadows and the ivy-covered wall that hugged the edge of the building. Inside, Natalie sat by the window, a candle flickering between her and a man I didn't recognize. He was handsome in an effortless, careless way. Dark hair swept back, a slight stubble that looked more deliberate than accidental. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he gestured as he spoke, the way someone does when they're used to being listened to. Natalie was laughing, not the polite, measured laugh she gave at dinner parties or when she humored one of my dry jokes. This was different. She was leaning forward, chin in her hand, eyes wide. She looked 20 again, unguarded, alive, hungry. Then came the moment that stopped my breath cold. He twirled a fork full of pasta, gently lifted it, and she leaned in. Her lips parted. She let him feed her, slowly, intimately, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her eyes never left his. She said she was learning to cook. She never said she was being fed. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The wind picked up around me, but I felt nothing. I watched as he reached for her hand, and she let him take it. His thumb brushed circles on her skin. She didn't pull away. I stepped back, not because I couldn't bear to watch, but because I'd seen enough. It wasn't about rage or heartbreak or betrayal anymore. It was clarity, the kind that slices straight through you and leaves nothing behind but bone-deep truth. I took out my phone, raised it carefully, and snapped a photo through the glass. It captured everything. Her posture, his eyes, the candlelight between them, the fork, her smile. That was all the evidence I needed, not for a courtroom, not even for a fight, but for myself. Proof that I hadn't been imagining it. Proof that I wasn't crazy. I didn't confront them. I didn't storm inside. What would that accomplish? Force her to lie again? Make a scene just to satisfy a momentary urge? No. I walked back to my car in silence, feeling oddly calm. That night she came home an hour later than usual. She carried a small box of pastries. Eclairs, raspberry tarts. "Chef, let us take some home," she said with a grin, holding them out like peace offerings. Her hair was still pinned up, her perfume still fresh. She looked at me like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just played house with another man in a dimly lit bistro. I didn't ask about the lesson. I didn't ask what she'd learned. Instead, I went to the kitchen drawer, pulled out a white plate, and set it on the table. "You've been cooking up the wrong story," I said, as I laid the photo down beside the untouched desserts. Her face fell before her words did. She reached for the picture with trembling fingers. "Ben, I held up a hand. Don't. I walked past her, leaving the pastries untouched. I'd already had more than enough sweetness spoiled by lies. She didn't speak at first. After I laid the photo down beside the pastries, the silence in the room grew thick, denser than any scream. Natalie stared at the image like it might change if she just willed it hard enough. Her breath caught in her throat, the tremor in her fingers betraying her composure even before she spoke a word. "I can explain," she finally whispered. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You don't need to," I said, my voice quiet but sharp. The photo explained plenty. Her eyes darted up to meet mine, wide with fear, or guilt, or some cocktail of both. "It's not what it looks like." "Really?" I tilted my head. "Because it looks like you were having dinner. Candlelight, wine, feeding him pasta. Forgive me if I mistook that for a romantic evening." Her mouth opened, then closed. She was always quick with words, able to pivot and redirect like a skilled debater. But tonight she stumbled. Her rehearsed lines weren't working. There was no script for being caught. "It wasn't serious," she said, a little louder now. It was a distraction. I didn't plan for anything to happen." "Distraction," I repeated, laughing softly, though nothing about this was funny. "You lied. Every single night you came home spinning stories about sauté pans and saffron and chefs with thick accents. You fed me lies, Natalie, and you did it with a smile." She stepped forward, hand extended like that gesture could erase the truth. "Ben, please, I just needed something different. I needed to feel something again. I didn't do it to hurt you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't recognize this version of my wife. The woman in front of me wasn't the one I'd built a life with, not the one who once clung to me during thunderstorms or whispered dreams into my ear at midnight. She was a stranger with familiar eyes. "I don't care why you did it," I said. "You made a choice, night after night. And you didn't stop until I found you." Natalie's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. "It was the way he talked about food," she began, voice trembling. "The way he made everything sound passionate. It reminded me of how I used to feel, about life, about myself." I let the silence return, let her sit in it for a while. She wanted understanding, but I couldn't give it to her. "You could have told me," I said finally. "You could have said you were feeling lost or numb or whatever this is. But instead, you built a lie out of olive oil and breadcrumbs." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I was afraid. I thought if I told you, it would break something between us." I walked to the dining table and pulled out a chair. Newsflash, you broke it anyway. Her shoulders slumped as she sat down across from me, the candle from our earlier dinner still in the center, now cold and unlit. "Are you going to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. "I haven't decided," I said honestly, "but I'm definitely not going to pretend this didn't happen." Her face crumpled. "It didn't mean anything, Ben, I swear it. He's not you, it was a fantasy, a brief escape." "You fed him," I said quietly. "That wasn't fantasy, that was real, and intimate, and deliberate. You looked at him like he mattered." The words landed hard. She flinched. "You used to look at me like that," she whispered. I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in shared guilt or poetic symmetry. This wasn't about who failed whom first. This was about trust, about the fragile, invisible thread that binds people together until someone decides to test how far it can stretch before it snaps. "I've been here," I said, "the whole time, working, listening, trying. You could have come to me." "I didn't know how," she said. "I didn't even know what I was feeling until it was too late." I nodded slowly, not out of agreement but resignation. "Well, now we both know." She reached across the table, but I didn't meet her hand. I stood instead. "I need time," I said, grabbing my jacket. "I need space to figure out what parts of this marriage are salvageable, if any." "Ben, please don't go," she called out, but her voice cracked, and the strength behind it dissolved. I turned at the door. "You were right about one thing," I said. "This wasn't about food. This was about feeling something. And now I feel nothing but disappointment." Then I left. No slammed doors, no shouting, just the sound of shoes on hard wood and the quiet click of the front door closing behind me. And for the first time in weeks, I could finally breathe. I didn't sleep at home that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly until I found a small roadside motel just off the interstate. Nothing special, just a room with clean sheets and a door that locked. I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling fan spinning overhead, the hum of it louder than my thoughts. There was no anger anymore, not even grief, just a numb, steady awareness that life as I knew it had tilted, slowly, quietly, until it couldn't be set right again. Natalie called once around midnight. I didn't answer. She texted the next morning, just 3 words. "Please come home." I didn't respond. Over the next few days, I began untangling our life from mine. I changed my banking passwords, moved a few personal items into a storage unit, and informed my office I'd be working remotely for a while. I needed distance, not just from her, but from the version of myself that had believed every word she told me without question. Natalie didn't stop trying. She left voicemails, pleas, apologies, promises to explain, to fix things, to go to therapy. She cooked, finally, sent photos of elaborate dishes, plates styled like a food magazine spread. It was almost cruel in its irony. The meals she claimed to be learning to make now arrived daily, but the appetite for reconciliation was already gone. One afternoon, she left a note at my office. "He meant nothing, you mean everything. Please don't let this be the end." It was written on the back of a recipe card for creme brulee. But here's the truth. Trust doesn't crack like a dropped dish. It shatters. You can gather the pieces, maybe even glue them back together, but you'll always see the lines where it broke, and you'll always know it's weaker than before. As for Luca, the man behind the affair, he didn't last. A colleague of mine who'd seen him around town said he'd left shortly after things blew up, packed up and disappeared like smoke, leaving Natalie behind with her new culinary tools and no one to impress. I doubted he ever saw a future with her. He wasn't after commitment, just a taste. The house stayed quiet. She tried to wait me out, hoping silence could be filled with forgiveness. But silence is its own kind of answer. Eventually I went back, not to stay, but to talk. We sat across from each other in the living room where we once shared everything, coffee, arguments, quiet Sundays. She looked different now, smaller, more fragile. Her makeup was gone, her hair pulled back in a way that made her seem years younger. Or maybe just more honest. She said all the right things. She cried, she asked what she could do to fix us. But some things can't be repaired. They can only be accepted. I told her I wished her peace. I hoped she found what she was looking for in all those half-baked dreams. But I couldn't be part of that search anymore. Not after everything. Not when she chose a fantasy over the life we built together. She didn't argue. Maybe she understood. Or maybe she was just too tired to try again. The divorce was quiet, civil, No shouting matches or courtroom theatrics. We split things fairly. I kept the house. She moved into a small apartment above a bakery downtown. The irony didn't escape me. In time, the pain softened into something more manageable. Regret didn't disappear, but it no longer stung. I went back to cooking simple meals for myself. Real food. Honest food. No stories behind it. Just me, a pan, and whatever I felt like eating that night. She said she was learning to cook. I learned something else entirely. I learned when it's time to leave the table and not look back.